There was a time when the people next door were more than neighbors. They were part of how the whole block survived. In the 1960s and 70s, many American neighborhoods ran on something that was never written down. People watched out for one another. They borrowed, shared, checked in, showed up, and somehow knew when help was needed. You did not need a group text, a neighborhood app, or a formal invitation. Sometimes all it took was a knock on the screen door. These small habits made ordinary streets feel like communities instead of rows of separate houses. If you grew up in one of those neighborhoods, some of these may feel almost impossible to forget. 1. Borrowing a cup of sugar. Running out of something did not always mean getting in the car and driving to a store. Sometimes your mother simply sent you next door with an empty measuring cup. Sugar, flour, an egg, a little milk, or a stick of butter could travel across a driveway in seconds. Nobody treated it like a transaction. There was rarely a receipt, a note, or even a serious promise to pay it back. Everyone seemed to understand that next week, the favor might go in the other direction. The exchange itself was small, but it said something much bigger. It said that the people living beside you were close enough to depend on. And for many families, that little walk next door was one of the first lessons in what being a neighbor meant. Sometimes the borrowed ingredient came back later in a different form, tucked inside cookies, a pie, or a plate sent across the yard. 2. Watching the kids for a few minutes. Formal childcare was not always the first answer when a parent needed help. A neighbor might keep an eye on the kids while someone ran to the store or finished an errand. Sometimes the children never even went inside the neighbor's house. They simply played in the yard while another adult watched from a porch or kitchen window. If somebody got hurt, wandered too far, or started an argument, an adult nearby usually noticed. Parents knew which houses had someone home during the day. Kids knew which mothers would give them a Band-Aid and which fathers would tell them to slow down. The arrangement was informal, but everyone understood the responsibility. You were not just watching your own children. In a way, the whole block was keeping an eye on everybody's kids. That shared attention gave children a surprising amount of freedom, while still surrounding them with adults who knew exactly where they belonged. 3. Collecting the mail while someone was away. When a family left town, the neighborhood often noticed before the car had even reached the highway. Someone next door might collect the mail and newspaper so nothing piled up outside. They might move a trash can, pick up a flyer, or make the house look lived in. There was no smart doorbell sending alerts to a phone. There was simply a neighbor who knew you were gone and paid attention. Sometimes they held onto packages or tucked the newspaper safely inside. Other times they brought everything over in one neat stack when you returned. It was a practical favor, but it also gave families peace of mind. Your house was not completely unattended because somebody nearby was still watching. Returning home often included a short front yard report about what arrived, who stopped by, and whether anything unusual happened while you were gone. 4. Watering the lawn and garden. Summer vacations created another familiar neighborhood ritual. Before leaving town, someone would hand a neighbor a hose, a key, or a few simple instructions. Please water the tomatoes. Do not forget the flowers by the porch. Give the front lawn a little water if it gets too dry. The neighbor doing the favor might also pull a weed or move a sprinkler without being asked. Kids were sometimes recruited for the job and took it surprisingly seriously. They knew exactly how long they were supposed to stand there with the hose. When the family came home, a green garden felt like proof that somebody had looked after the place. It was another quiet way neighbors made absence feel less risky. And if the garden produced too many tomatoes while you were gone, the neighbor doing the watering might be told to take a few home. 5. Helping when a car would not start. A dead battery could turn a driveway into an instant neighborhood gathering. One person lifted the hood. Another brought jumper cables. Somebody else leaned over the engine and offered an opinion with complete confidence. You did not always call roadside assistance first. Often you called the man 2 houses down who seemed to know something about every car on the block. He might tap a battery terminal, check a cable, or listen to the engine turn over. Sometimes several neighbors stood around, even when only one person was actually helping. That was part of the ritual. The car problem became a 10-minute community event. And when the engine finally started, everyone felt like the block had solved it together. A favor like that was rarely forgotten, especially the next time the helper's own car needed a push, a tool, or an extra pair of hands. 6. Shoveling someone else's sidewalk. After a heavy snow, the sound of metal shovels could spread from house to house. People cleared their own steps and then sometimes kept going. An older neighbor's sidewalk might be done before they ever came outside. A family away for the weekend could return to a path already cleared. Teenagers might shovel several houses, sometimes for money and sometimes simply because they had been asked. The line between your property and your neighbor's property felt a little less important under fresh snow. If you already had the shovel in your hands, clearing 10 more feet did not seem like much. But to the person who needed the help, it could mean everything. Those extra few minutes were one of the simplest ways a neighborhood showed who it cared about. You could often tell which streets were close by looking at the sidewalks after a storm, where one cleared path simply continued into the next. 7. Bringing food when something happened. In many neighborhoods, major life events arrived with casserole dishes. A new baby, an illness, a death in the family, or a difficult week could bring food to the front door. Nobody needed to organize a meal train online. Word simply traveled from one house to another. Soon, a kitchen table might hold baked chicken, lasagna, soup, pie, or something wrapped tightly in foil. The food was practical because the family had one less thing to worry about. But the dish carried another message with it. We heard what happened. We are thinking about you. You are not handling this alone. Sometimes the plate came back weeks later, and sometimes nobody remembered exactly who owned which casserole dish. The kitchen became a kind of neighborhood message board, each covered plate quietly announcing who had stopped by and who was thinking of the family. 8. Lending tools without thinking twice. Not every garage had every tool, and it did not need to. If you needed a ladder, a wrench, a rake, or a power drill, you probably knew who had one. The walk across the yard could save a trip to the hardware store. Borrowed tools moved from garage to garage all summer long. Sometimes they came back the same afternoon. Sometimes a neighbor had to knock a week later and politely ask if you still had his hedge clippers. Nobody found that unusual. The neighborhood itself functioned like a shared toolbox. People saved money, solved problems faster, and had one more reason to talk to each other. Even a borrowed screwdriver could keep a relationship active. And standing in the driveway talking about the repair often lasted longer than the repair itself, turning a practical errand into an ordinary visit. 9. Taking in trash cans. Trash day had its own neighborhood rhythm. Cans went out near the curb, trucks came through, and empty containers waited to be pulled back. If a neighbor worked late or was away, someone might drag the can up the driveway for them. It took less than a minute. Most of the time, nobody even mentioned it. You simply came home and noticed the can was already where it belonged. Small favors like this were easy to overlook because they were so ordinary. But that was exactly what made them meaningful. Nobody needed praise for doing them. They were just part of living close to other people and paying attention. The nicest part was coming home tired and realizing someone had already done one tiny chore you thought was still waiting for you. 10. Checking on older neighbors. Every block seemed to have a few people everyone quietly watched over. Maybe it was an older widow living alone. Maybe it was a retired couple who had been on the street longer than anyone else. Neighbors noticed if the curtain stayed closed unusually late. They noticed if the newspaper sat outside too long. Someone might knock on the door, bring in groceries, or ask if anything was needed. Children were sometimes sent over with a plate of food or a simple message from their parents. These visits were rarely described as community care. They were just what decent neighbors did. And for older residents, knowing that somebody nearby would notice a problem could make all the difference. Sometimes the check-in was nothing more than a wave through the window, but even that could confirm that the familiar daily routine was still intact. 11. Giving someone a ride. Before every teenager had access to a car, and before ride-hailing existed, neighbors often filled the gaps. A ride to work, church, the doctor, practice, or the grocery store could be arranged with one quick conversation. Parents coordinated carpools almost casually. If one family was already going that direction, another child simply climbed into the back seat. Seat assignments were flexible, schedules were imperfect, and everybody squeezed in. Adults repaid the favor later by driving the next time. It saved gasoline, saved time, and kept families connected. More importantly, it created a steady pattern of depending on people who lived only a few doors away. Those rides also created conversations between generations, with neighborhood kids hearing stories and advice from adults they might otherwise barely have known. 12. Keeping a spare house key. Long before keypad locks and phone-controlled doors, a trusted neighbor sometimes held the spare key. It might hang on a hook in their kitchen or sit in a drawer everyone knew about. If a child got locked out after school, there was somewhere to go. If someone needed to enter the house during an emergency, the key was nearby. Giving a neighbor that key required something simple but important: trust. You were allowing another family access to your private space because you believed they would use it only when needed. That kind of trust was built slowly, through years of small interactions. And once it existed, the spare key became a quiet symbol of how close two households had become. Children often knew exactly which neighbor had the key, making that house the automatic destination when they heard the terrible click of a locked door. 13. Looking after pets. When families went away, pets often stayed behind, with help from next door. A neighbor came over to fill a bowl, let the dog outside, or check on the cat. Kids were often thrilled to get the assignment. They might cross the yard twice a day with a key and a very serious sense of duty. Sometimes the pet already knew them well because it had seen them almost every day. There were no pet cameras and no automatic feeders sending updates. You trusted the person next door to remember. And usually, they did. By the time the family returned, the neighbor had another small story to tell about what the dog or cat had done. The favor worked because neighborhood life had already made the animal, the house, and the people familiar rather than completely separate. 14. Showing up when something broke. A broken pipe, fallen branch, flooded basement, or damaged fence could bring neighbors out fast. People heard the noise, saw the problem, or noticed someone struggling. Within minutes, extra hands sometimes appeared. One person brought a saw. Another brought a bucket. Someone else simply held the flashlight. Not everyone was an expert, but that rarely stopped them from helping. The first goal was often just to keep the situation from getting worse. Later, professionals could handle whatever remained. But in those first stressful minutes, having 3 or 4 neighbors beside you changed everything. The problem still belonged to one household, yet the response somehow belonged to the whole street. Later, people might joke about the mess while leaning against a fence, but in the moment, nobody needed to be invited to lend a hand. 15. Sitting with someone who needed company. Not every favor involved tools, food, or errands. Sometimes the most important thing a neighbor did was sit down and stay a while. A porch chair, kitchen table, or front step could become the place where people talked through bad news. Someone who had lost a spouse might find a neighbor at the door more often. A person recovering from illness might get short visits just to break up the day. Nobody called it emotional support. They brought coffee, talked about the weather, mentioned the kids, and listened. The conversation could look ordinary from the outside, but it told someone they had not disappeared from the world. And perhaps that was the greatest neighborhood favor of all. Years later, people may forget exactly what was said during those visits, but they often remember who kept coming back to sit beside them. None of these customs were perfect, and not every street was as close as people remember. But in many communities, neighbors once depended on each other in dozens of small, practical ways. They shared food, tools, rides, keys, time, attention, and trust. Most favors were too small to make a story by themselves. Together, they created something people still miss: a feeling that the houses around yours were not occupied by strangers. They were occupied by people who knew your name, noticed when something was wrong, and sometimes helped before you even asked. Which of these do you remember from your neighborhood? And what was one thing your neighbors did for each other that almost never happens anymore?